Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and today we're going to be looking at a pretty basic epoxy repair which we haven't really covered yet. So my Uncle Jerry was surfing the other week and he was going down the line and there was some fella sitting on his surfboard, didn't get out of the way quick enough, and Uncle Jerry rode the nose of this 10-foot male straight into old mate's hip. You can see on the bottom side of the board here it's enough to have knocked all the foam away from the stringer, and on the deck side it's been a high enough impact to actually split the stringer. So I don't know how Buddy's hip is, but he's probably pretty sore. People tend to complicate things at this stage. Oh, the stringer's split, it's lifted, I don't know how I'm going to go about this repair. Our first step with stuff like this is always sanding. We're going to sand it first and then we'll make a game plan from there. So you might have noticed that on that bottom side there was some lifting and some cracking of the hot coat or the final resin coat on the board. So we're going to get all of that smooth, even if we have to bring it all the way down to the cloth. We're going to sand it really hard. We're using 120 here, and then on the top side where the stringer is split, same thing, we're going to sand it super hard. You can use 80 grit if you want. Our only goal here is to get everything nice and smooth, any crap sanded off, and get it to a stage where it's ready to do something. We maybe don't know what that something is yet, but we know we have to sand it first regardless of what we do. So while sanding, I noticed that there's no movement in the stringer at all. The foam that had broken away from the stringer, I can't move it with my fingers. There's no fiberglass delamination, so I didn't have to cut anything away. So although the crack looks pretty severe, there's actually no movement at all. So I'm pretty confident we can just resin dam it. Both sides, we're going to level it off with a little bit of resin, give it a sand, and we can just repair straight over the top. We don't have to replace any glass, we don't have to replace any stringer, which is good news. So I use two types of epoxies in my workshop. The one I use the most is this one, so it's an Entropy CLR, or a clear laminating resin. The second one I use is Kinetics, also an ultra clear, and with both of these I use the fast hardener. It can sound intimidating, fast, but trust me, with epoxy, nothing's fast. Epoxies are notoriously sensitive and difficult to work with. They're particularly sensitive to any outside chemicals or situations such as humidity, temperature, oils from your fingers, dust, other chemicals like acetones, paints, things like that. I really only use the Kinetics on really bright and white surfboards, usually high performance shortboards, something like a JS Monster Box. I have found that if I use the Entropy overboards like that, it does look kind of yellow in comparison to whatever resin they're using, and I think that resin is quite often Kinetics. There's a few reasons I don't use the Kinetics too often, and I do prefer to use the Entropy. The first reasons are very simple. The resin with Kinetics is much thicker and it's harder to pour in small amounts to weigh it out. And I also find in small amounts, keeping in mind I'm a ding repairer, would probably be different if I was mixing large quantities of this stuff, but the shape of the hardener bottle's spout I find extremely difficult to pour in small amounts without spilling. As well as this, I find the Kinetics is extremely sensitive to those outside influences we spoke about before, and it is not uncommon when I pour coats of this resin that the resin ends up fish-eyeing. I have to sand it, and quite often I have to put a second coat on. It is recommended with epoxies that you clean the surface with acetone before you pour resins. The Kinetics seems to be a little hit and miss. Sometimes a pour will go well, sometimes it won't. Entropy, on the other hand, I've been working with for quite a long time, and I very, very, very rarely have any issues or need to re-pour a coat of this stuff. I have found over the years that if I acetone a surface before I pour Entropy resin over it, it actually tends to fisheye. So now before I pour this resin, I blow the surface off with my air compressor, I wipe it down with a towel, and I blow the surface off again. I don't put any acetone or other chemicals on there, and I get a pretty much perfect result every time at this point. The only time I've ever noticed any type of yellowing with the entropy resin is on particular models of boards where I suspect they are using kinetics, and so the entropy is perhaps slightly yellower than the manufacturer's epoxy resin. If you're doing maybe an older board or something that isn't shaped to be so bright and white, like those high performance short boards, I've had no troubles with this at all. It is very rare that this resin appears yellow after a repair. Of these two particular resins, I would highly recommend the entropy over the kinetics. Again, I'm only speaking from a ding repairer's perspective. I've only ever fully laminated boards with entropy, never with kinetics, so I can't really speak in that regards. But for ding repairs, I'll buy entropy any day of the week over kinetics. So, with all that said, we are going to be using the entropy today. So we're going to mix up a very small amount for these resin dams. Keep in mind it's basically a 24-hour drying process with both of these epoxies, so each side of this board is actually 2 days. I'm going to do a resin dam on one side one day, go back to it the next day, do the other side. So it is very time consuming, this epoxy stuff. It's a 2-to-1 mixing ratio, so I think this is 15 mils total. It's 10 mils of resin and 5 mils of hardener, and I count to 120 when I mix this stuff. The general rule with epoxy is once you think you've fully mixed it, keep mixing it. You really don't want to undermix this stuff at all. The other thing I'll point out too is you'll notice I'm mixing this stuff pretty hard and fast. With the kinetics, if I was to mix the same amount in this same cup, the kinetics is really prone to air bubbles. As you mix it, a lot of bubbles appear. And by 120 seconds, you basically have a cup of bubbles. It froths up like dishwashing liquid in a cup of water. So you have to mix it much slower, more gently. Kind of makes me a little bit paranoid that it's not mixed properly, so I end up mixing it for longer. It's just a little bit of a headache that I don't need. So here we're just filling up our resin dam. Obviously the next day we're going to flip the board over and do the exact same thing on the other side. And we've got 15 mils of resin here, which is far too much for a job like this, but it's almost impossible to mix without scales a smaller amount than this. So we've got heaps of resin to play with, so we want to make sure that any low spots are built up nice and high. You can't put too much resin because we're going to sand it all to shape anyway, so most of this will disappear. 2 days later, both sides are poured, so we're going to sand it all up to shape, get it all nice and smooth. I'm using 120 here. I'm going to sand a nice big area because this board was waxed all the way to the nose. So for lamination, I've cleaned all the wax off, I've degreased it all, but I just want to make sure there's no wax anywhere near this repair. Just while we're here watching me sand boards, which is super fun, I know, I will just mention, some people do comment that my camera flickers, or the lights flicker on the camera, which I'm aware of. They did suggest I turn the shutter speed down or something like that, but I've discovered that I'm using a GoPro and I can't actually adjust that setting, whatever it was on the camera, so I can't prevent that flickering, unfortunately. So the deal I've made with myself and that I'm going to make with you guys is once this channel gets to 1,000 subscribers, I'm going to rush out first thing and buy myself a new camera. A camera where I can adjust those types of settings and prevent things like lights flickering. So if that flickering does irritate you, or maybe you're epileptic, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let's work towards a new camera. So exactly the same as if we were laminating with epoxy, the only goal here is to saturate that cloth fully. We want it all to disappear and be fully soaked out, and then wipe off any excess resin at the end. We are wrapping around the rails to the deck side on this particular job. The nice thing about using epoxy is that the gel time is 30 to 40 minutes depending on the temperature, so we've got heaps of time to lay the cloth down perfectly flat on the point of the nose and around the rails. Notice that I am wearing a full face mask even though I'm using a bio epoxy. No, this stuff doesn't smell. Yes, the hardener in this stuff is still pretty toxic and you don't want to be breathing it in or absorbing it in through your eyeballs. Get yourself a good mask and wear it religiously. So this brings us to the key difference between working with epoxy versus working with poly. If we were working with poly, we could just hot coat straight away at this stage. But with epoxy, every step needs sanding before more resin is placed on top. The risk is that if we over sand it, we're actually going to weaken the cloth we've just put over our repair, so that's no good. So really what I try and do is focus on the edges of the cloth get them nice and flush, and I just want to scuff the parts of the cloth that are over the repair itself. You can see a bit of shine here, so that's what I'm looking for. Any bits of shine, like that little section there, I want to get rid of that. I need the area sanded well so that my next coat's going to adhere to it. So as I said earlier, with the entropy, I don't use acetone. If this were kinetics, I would have acetoned it first, but in this case, I've blown it off with the compressor, I've wiped it down with the towel, I've blown it off with the compressor again, masked it off, and now I'm pouring that resin coat. You'll notice that my masking tape doesn't follow the apex of the rail as it wraps around the nose. It's actually underneath the board to the deck side, and that's because I don't want to be sanding the apex of the rail, because I'm going to sand through on that. So with poly or epoxy, always have your tape on the opposite side of the board, and then you can sand on a flat surface, not on an apex. So our pour on the bottom side of the board has cured, so right now I'm sanding away the tape edge on the deck side of the board, so we're going to get that nice and flat. Then we're going to flip the board over and we're going to sand the resin that we have just poured on the bottom side, so we're going to get rid of that edge and we're going to have it all nice and scuffed up. So when we go to pour our next coat on the deck side, our tape can be underneath on that bottom side again, and we're actually going to have 2 layers of resin wrapping those rails, which is going to help prevent sand through on our final sand. So you can see here the deck side has been poured and that tape is underneath the board, so we've got 2 layers of resin wrapping those rails. It's just extra protection on those sensitive areas where it's really easy to sand through if you're not concentrating. So at this point, same process as every other job. We're going to sand all our hard edges off of our new pour with 120, then we're going to sand everything with 240, then with 320, that's all on the orbital. Then we're going to take it outside, we're going to sand it with 320 wet, 400 wet, and if you wish to go further than that, be my guest. I'm going to bring that board inside, we're going to buff both sides well beyond our area of repair and well beyond where we've sanded to kind of blend our nice finish down the board a little bit. And then after that we're done. That's an epoxy repair, and I hope you've learnt something with that. Any questions, please feel free as always to leave them in the comments. And yeah, good luck. Epoxy can be a pain in the ass, and it takes a lot of time, so you need some patience. As always, you guys, thanks so much for watching, and yeah, we'll see you in the next one. Chee-hoo!